Welcome to the Soberish Uprising. My name is Holly Crevo, a former heavy drinker who started Soberish Uprising of her own a little over 2.5 years ago, and everything in her life has changed. On the Soberish Uprising, we tell stories of finding freedom from alcohol on our own terms, making it our best power move. So today I am joined by my new friend, Margy, who is co-founder of Sober Life Rocks. And I am so excited to hop into this conversation about all things, and also including the mission of your company, which is creating sober networking and meeting spaces, which I think is so important. So welcome.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you so much. I'm excited to get to know you and get to know you more here in this space.
Thank you. Me too. So we share an affinity and love for Dr. Tara McCarthy, who is an amazing coach for healthcare professionals. And so we were on a visioning call together for 2024, and I had Sober Shy Uprising, she had Sober Life Rocks, and we're like, hey, we need to connect. So it was very kismety.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Well, I'd love to, we're going to get into what you do in Sober Life Rocks, but I would love to hear, what is your sober story? How did you come to sobriety? And if you're open, sharing a little bit more about what brought you here.
Absolutely. So I think it's best to start at the beginning. I had my first drink at 8 years old because my mother was a practicing alcoholic, and she kept one of those tall glasses with scotch and water that was sort of this endless glass going in the door of the refrigerator. And so I would see her open up the door, take a sip, put it back, and close the door. So at 8, of course, what do? Open the door, take a sip. It was disgusting, but then I felt the burn and I felt the warmth. And I think that's where the spark was lit. And I think I probably had not uncommon drinking through middle school, high school, experimenting, getting way too drunk. But it really wasn't until post-college that my drinking took a turn. My first husband and I, he had a best friend who was a wine distributor. And so he was learning how to teach people about tastings. So he would bring over 6 bottles of wine and wrap them in a brown paper so that we couldn't see the labels. And he would tell me what kind of food to prepare for this. And then we would have these little art tastings of the different wine and talk about the nuances of them. And so never mind the fact that between the 3 of us, we would regularly finish off those 6 bottles of wine because otherwise that would be alcohol abuse. Yeah. And so that's kind of where my drinking took a turn, because now I had this whole justification system that it really wasn't about the drinking. Now it was about the art.
Yes.
And fast forward about 7-8 years, that first husband and I got a divorce, and now I had 2 toddlers, and I would still cook these fancy steak and mushroom sauce dinners for me and my toddlers so that I could justify the art of having a nice entire bottle of wine to myself. There came a time when I never missed work. I was the head of the PTA for a couple of years. I was always like the soccer mom. I was all the things. So I never missed any of those things. But I also never made it home from work without having to detour through the store to get myself my drink. So it will be 19 years on February 7th that my family gifted me with an intervention. But this was a kinder, softer intervention in that what this guy did, he was brilliant. He called it a alcohol awareness education weekend for the entire family. Yeah. And of course I knew exactly what it was, and they put my brother up to inviting me, and I said, there's no way I'm going. And he said, look, it's not about like pointing the finger at you. This is about all of us. And if it turns into that, he's like, I'm going to hold the door and walk out with you. And I said to him, is our relationship worth it to you that I trust you on this? And he said, yes.
Mm.
So true to his word, that's exactly what this guy did. He talked about the disease of alcoholism. He talked about the family dynamics with alcoholism. We talked about the fact that my mother had been an alcoholic, and we sort of did a family tree on both sides. And then he started talking about the sensation of craving. And he said to my dad, he said, "Do you drink coffee in the morning?" And my dad said, well, yes, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Have you ever had that experience where you reach up into the cupboard to grab that coffee can and you pull it down and shake it and it's empty? And that panic of, oh, I'm not going to have coffee this morning."
Yeah.
And my dad's like, yeah. And he said, well, that's a little bit like the sensation of craving for an alcoholic. And my dad said, really? And I looked at him and I said, you don't know that? So it was one of those weekends where there was these ahas that were going on all the way around.
Yeah.
And at the end, we talked about the chaos that my life was at the time. And I said to this interventionist, I said, look, if you take away my drink, it's not going to stop the fact that I'm a single mom. It's not going to stop the fact that I've got this jerk of an ex-husband. It's not going to stop the fact that, I work this crazy, heavy corporate job. It's not going to change the fact that I'm like just barely making ends meet. And he sort of smiled and he said, no, but it will change you. And that's when I agreed that I would take on this journey.
Oh, it will change you. Do you remember like what that felt like inside when you heard that?
I remember not believing him in my own mind, but what I believed was that he was so sure of it.
Oh, interesting.
And so I was willing to buy into his belief because my best thinking, as we say, my best thinking had got me to where I was.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So him and your brother, right? To keep influential people for your brother to be like, no, I'm with you. We're not, this isn't a blame. If it is, we are out. That's my promise. And then this other gentleman, you're like, I don't believe it, but if you believe it, I believe you. How powerful is that?
And I have to say that sensation was what I hung on to in various iterations for the first year. So many people, when they decide to get sober, it's because they have crashed and burned. They have lost everything and they're just desperate. They're willing to do whatever. That wasn't my story.
Yeah.
I mean, I was very successful in my job. I was like I said, a single mom doing all the things. I had great friendships. I had great relationships with my family. And so my getting sober was a little different. And I think in many ways harder because I didn't have the degree of the crash and burn that other people did.
Yeah.
And in fact, I say now, again, I was gifted with a sensation of craving. I was craving alcohol for a good 6 months on an hourly basis. And for many people, that's lifted after the first week or two.
Yeah.
But I think what it did was it made me work that much harder and dedicate myself that much stronger to this commitment that I had made to myself that while these things wouldn't change, I would change. And so I kept leaning into that belief and I kept listening to the people around me and kept reaching out to other sober people. I mean, my story took me to Alcoholics Anonymous, but people who I could see the life that I wanted.
Yeah. And knowing if they could do it, you could do it. If they believed. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So, oh my gosh, I just really lost my question. So you're talking about, this, what you said is, which I think is interesting. You didn't crash and burn. You were successful mom. Like, so then how was drinking a problem for you then?
Oh, it was all kinds of problems. I just didn't see it at the time.
Yeah.
It was covering everything in my life. All I did was cope. And so fun things weren't as fun because I needed to cope with the other stressors in my life. Now, don't get me wrong. I did some things that I'm not proud of, and I had behaviors that I wish that I hadn't done. But I had just sort of tucked those away as things that I wasn't going to look at.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got sober that I looked at that and I said, oof, I had this in my mind. I was this like well put together person, and I was teetering on the edge of really awful stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, dangerous situations and not good stuff.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Because again, I think so many times we think there has to be a rock bottom, like people, but that's not always the case. And it's when we're especially high achieving women, like we're really good at masking what's going on, right? We're really good at like putting, whether it's drinking or stress or whatever your thing is, like this mask, like it's okay. And then you pull it back, you're like, oh, no, it's not okay.
Well, case in point. So the final straw for my parents came when I went back to DC, which is my hometown, for a high school reunion. So I borrowed their car that night. I was going to the thing, and I had vowed to myself I was only going to have a drink or two because I had an important business meeting I was flying to the next day. I didn't want to make a fool out of myself, like all the things. Yeah. And I walked in and had that massive anxiety. I didn't know anybody anymore. It was a room full of strangers that like they seemed to all know each other. And I'm just basically sort of an introvert at heart. And so that first glass or two that I had promised myself I was going to stop at, they weren't even putting a dent in that anxiety. And I don't know how many drinks I had that night, but I do know that we closed out the party and went to the bar. And I do know that we closed out the bar. And I do know that other people who were with us said that they were too drunk to drive. And I said, no problem, I'm okay. And so I drove a classmate back to his place, which was on the way back to where my house was. And there was a really, really, really bad storm by DC standards blowing through. Like they were worried about tornado warnings, and there was sort of hurricane, gale force winds and all the things. And after I dropped him off on my way home, I took a corner too fast and ended up wrapping my dad's car around a telephone pole, which resulted in like jaws of life having to get me out, compound fracture in my leg, all the things. Fast forward now 6 weeks to when I went to a treatment center, and they said to me, like, how are you saying that you didn't have any problems with alcohol? For God's sake, you almost died in a drunk driving accident. And I said, no, it wasn't because I was drunk. It's because the weather was so bad, I hydroplaned. And one of the gals looked at me and she said, how many years have you been driving in bad weather? And I said, most of my life. And she said, how many times have you wrapped your car around a telephone pole? So the denial system is strong in me. It's strong in me. And it wasn't until I got sober that I was able to look at some of that and say, yeah, maybe I was a little drunk that night, maybe a lot drunk that night.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah. Like what a blessing to have those people that reflect your truth to you, right? When you're, and that you were, wherever in your journey, you were open to receiving that, because we're not always open to receiving it until it's our time to receive that. Yeah.
I mean, it was painful to look at, but it was helpful. It was so helpful.
Yeah. So you're 19 years in, congratulations, 19 in 2 weeks. That's phenomenal. Would love to hear, now were you open about your sobriety, like once you became sober? Cause now you have a company on it. Like, what was that kind of like, coming out, for lack of a better word, of your sober journey?
Well, I was not. And think about, 20 years ago, I think that there was still a lot of judgment around people who were in recovery, especially who, like me, use the word recovering alcoholic. It just wasn't talked about. And amongst the people that I respected in AA, people talked a lot about anonymity. They talked a lot about, you don't have to tell anybody, it's none of their business. There was a lot of conversation around, do you tell your workplace or not tell your workplace? Like we did a lot of work before I went off on that treatment center. That was one of my big fears, was my company would find out where I was. And so this guy knew all the laws and all the right keywords to say and all the things. So I kept it very, very private. I was petrified that anybody would find out. And I remember like early in my sobriety, it was probably maybe 8 months in, I started at a new company, and I was in charge of going to this conference where I had to meet a bunch of the speakers that were going to be speaking on this company's behalf. And I was told I needed to go out and wine and dine them. And so that moment came when they started passing around the wine list. And as the host, they handed it first to me.
Yeah.
And I sort of froze, and I opened it up and I said, I don't know anything about this. Would somebody else like to pick something? And passed this menu off. I mean, those are my best friends. I couldn't go down. That menu with all those wine bottles, that was my best friend list. I couldn't go down that. I couldn't start going down and looking at all that. I had to just quickly pass it on to somebody else. So yeah, I did a lot to make sure that nobody knew and nobody guessed. And that carried through all the way until just 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, I left that corporate job and I started my own company. I'm a speaker coach. And I was given the opportunity to speak at a conference of speakers. So it's like my perfect audience, right? It's like all the people that I want, and I'm just launching my business, and this was like my big break. And I am pumped, I'm ready. And I thought, okay, I've got 10 years sober. There's no reason to be ashamed anymore. And what I teach my clients is that when you're going to be speaking in front of an audience that doesn't know you, it's really important to let them in first. Let them know who you are, what you're about, what you're passionate about, and why you're bringing yourself and your expertise to them. So I talked with my sponsor, I talked with some other friends, and they all agreed that this would be a reasonable thing. So as my opening, I told an abbreviated version of the story that I'm going to tell you right now, which is that I grew up with this alcoholic mother, that things were chaotic in our household, that as a young kid, I basically had to help raise my brother, that I remember stealing money out of her purse to ride my bike down to the 7-Eleven to buy bread and milk because sometimes there wasn't food in the house. And that somewhere in my 20s, I'm sure, and that I didn't grow up with any of the adulting skills. Because she wasn't able to be there for that. I had coping skills, but not really adulting skills. And so somewhere in my 20s, I'm sure that people were around me who were like, hey, you might not want to do this, or hey, you might want to do that. But by that time, I was deep in the drinking and didn't hear them. And it wasn't until I got sober that those mentors that started showing up, that I could see them and that they could help me. And that women who I had never trusted before suddenly were there to teach me how to put on makeup, to teach me how to dress more professionally, to teach me how to be a good mother or a good wife or a good friend or a good daughter, like all the things that I had just sort of barreled through with alcohol covering over my awareness. Now I needed to learn, in a whole new way. And I will never be able to thank those women enough or repay them. And the reality is, they're not the sort of people who'd want that anyhow. But with my gratitude, the best that I can do is to pay that forward and help other people become the best version of themselves. And that is why I'm so passionate about my career as a speaking coach, because I can help other people become better versions of themselves. Now, at this point, the audience is leaning in. Right? They're eating out of my hands, and now they're ready to hear what I have to say. And the rest of the talk, Holly, went fantastically. Like it was beyond my wildest dreams. And I had people literally running up to me at the end with their business cards.
Amazing.
I want to hire you. I want to hire you. And so I was just on cloud 9. And a little bit later, when the crowds had moved aside, a woman came up to me. And she said, that was such a good talk, and I really appreciate that, but you might not want to share about that sober stuff. Like, people might judge you. And I thought, all right, Well, then later that evening, another gentleman who was also very influential in that group said the same thing to me in different words. And at that point, I made the decision that I wasn't going to talk about it again. And so all these years in my industry and amongst my professional colleagues, maybe 4 of my closest friends know that I'm sober.
Still?
Never. No, up until
Okay.
the end of October. Yeah.
Okay.
And so this message of like, people are going to judge you.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy too is you had evidence of like all these other people who thought you were amazing, right? And how we can let those 1 or 2, no matter what, just like get at us, right? It's like 100 people can love you, but if one person doesn't, it's like, why don't they love me?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
how,
but all my worst fears that somebody might judge me, and then they come up, these were influential people, came up and said people might judge you. So what I hear is like, I'm judging you and others might not tell you. But it's funny because at 10 years sober, I mean, like, my life is amazing. I've got my act together as much as any adult actually does.
Not as much as any of us, if we're honest about it.
Right.
Figuring it out as we go.
But even 10 years ago, Holly, I think that the shame factor was still in play.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what I'm so excited about today is that the world is changing. The dialogue is changing. Having people like you, having celebrities, having the medical profession all talk about things in a non-judgmental and in fact, excited manner. It's a whole new world out there.
Yeah. Well, and it's I don't know what the word would even be, but like I have this sadness for so many people like you and before, the years before, who had this like shame because society did have a stigma, right? Like if you're an AA, you're broken, you're weak, all this stuff. And you're like, no, they're just the ones brave enough to be like, I don't need this, right? And so it's like, now I think people like me get to come into a space where it's more social, it's still not totally, it's more socially accepted. And so I hope you and whoever's listening, if you are somebody weren't able to be proud to show yourself the grace, because it makes sense that you weren't, right? Like it still is very stigmatized in some work environments and places.
Well, and I'll be honest. I think that that stigma has kept people from going to AA or getting sober because, to admit to yourself or to your loved ones that you have a problem with alcohol, there was so much shame and blame and the mental image of the person who had lost everything, guy with a brown bag under the bridge type of thing. And I love that you're bringing a whole new spin on that. I love that it's okay to have a recognition that alcohol isn't serving you the way that you wanted it to serve you anymore, and that you can try a different way and see how you feel.
Yeah.
That it's not an all or nothing proposition, that it's not a, I'm giving up everything I've ever used to cope, but rather I'm experimenting with another way to see if there's other coping strategies, like genius.
And coping strategies that actually work. Because I always go back to like, if drinking worked, it would have worked, right? Like if it helped me cope and like heal and like recover, like it would have done and I would have needed it anymore.
Right.
But it's tricky. It's very tricky. It makes us think it. And you're like, wait a minute, I've been doing this for years. Well, and I know you started, you have your speaker coaching business and then Sober Life Rocks. So October is really when you kind of really boldly stepped into this place of like 19 years sober, and we're going to create sober, inclusive meeting spaces.
Yeah.
That is amazing. Congratulations. That is awesome.
Thank you.
That is awesome.
So one more story on that one. Yeah. So we were at it was actually a women entrepreneurial conference, and there was about 150 women there. And one of the panels was on mind, body, and spirit. And so my co-founder was the speaker on that panel. And so different women were talking about different ways to come more into yourself. And she shared, she's always been very open. She shared about her sobriety and how that had helped her to just do things a whole different way. and was kind of spontaneously moved in the moment to stop and say, how many people in this room are either sober or, just don't drink?
Mm-hmm.
Now, she and I knew about each other, but I didn't know about anybody else in this room. And I knew probably 3/4 of the women in this room. We were stunned when about 15% of the women raised their hands, and we didn't know about each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is the deal. You don't talk about it.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
And so we all were just looking at each other, just going, wow. And my experience I go to a lot of professional meetings.
Yeah.
My experience is that as soon as I go to those networking events, I'll stay for the first maybe half hour to an hour, depending on how things go. And then things start getting sloppy and I bolt from my room. Now, the reality is that I pay a lot of money to go to those meetings, not because I need the education, because I can get that online, but for networking.
Yeah.
And yet an hour in, I'm bolting from my room. And so we started talking to other people and they do the same thing because it's not fun. It's not fun to just be at an alcohol forward, sloppy drunk fest.
Yeah.
So she and I grabbed each other. We went to lunch and we got talking. And we said, we've got to do something. We've got to do something so that people don't feel so alone anymore. This is just nuts.
Yeah.
And thus Sober Life was born. But I told her my story about how I'd never talked about it since that day at that speaker meeting. And she's like, well, are you going to be okay with talking about it? And I had a moment of gut check. And I said, it is time to get baby out of the corner. I am no longer going to worry about what somebody thinks about the fact that I no longer drink. Because it's an accomplishment and it's brought me to the world in a whole new way. So why in the world would I want to be quiet about that? So our mission is twofold. On the one hand, we want to build this community of people who are either sober or sober-ish or sober curious. And in fact, we're even including what I call sober wingmen, which is people who are in support of our mission. We want to bring them together in this community in such a way that when people are going to a particular conference in our industry, we can put them in communication with each other before the meeting. They can pre-network. Then have a kickoff coffee meeting before the first meeting. So then they can put a face to a name and then they can communicate with each other throughout the conference so that if they're at an after party and it starts getting sloppy, they can quickly get in touch with another person and say, hey, let's get out of here and go grab a dessert, right?
It's beautiful.
Yes. And so that's our first mission is just to really build this community. But the second part of the mission I think is even more important. And that's this notion of normalizing sober choices at these events. And so we're actually starting to work with meeting planners. And we're saying, what can we do to build sober inclusive spaces? And what is a sober inclusive space?
Yeah.
And is it more than just having, the club soda and the lime? Right? So can we first of all look at non-alcoholic drinks that are fun, that are tasty, that are innovative?
Yeah.
Because in our research and in our conversations, what we found is that there's a lot of people who do drink who they would love to switch over to a non-alcoholic drink after their first glass of wine or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe because they're at a conference, they don't want to be drinking because they want to get up the next morning and feel good.
Yeah.
Then it's more than that. It's also what can we do to create spaces at these professional meetings so that networking is actually networking again. I don't know about you, but how many of these meetings have you been to where the music is cranked up so loud that you're screaming in somebody's ear and they're guessing what you're saying?
Yeah. There's no purpose. Yeah.
But that's not to say that we don't love to get out and dance. So what if we have what if we had sort of an adjacent space, which was more like a lounge that maybe had some fun games in it, or maybe had some interactive things in it, so that people could go into the lounge and enjoy the networking, enjoy the conversations, and they hear their favorite song come on and they go running to the dance floor, and then they come running back out again and sit down with their buddies. I mean, these are the sorts of ways that we believe sober inclusivity is about everybody.
Yes.
It's about making space for everybody to have fun, not just about the alcohol.
Because what I'm hearing is it's not saying there's no booze at these things. Like, you can have it, but let's also have just as many great options for those who choose not to, right? I love it, because I was at an event a couple weeks ago and it was genius. They have a pajama party as like the big event, which is great, because then you're not worried about getting dressed up. You're just going. And I love it. For the first time ever, they had a little sign and it had mocktails, like they had mojitos. And I noticed there was a lot of women, some who I don't, who were like, I don't drink as much. This is a great option. It wasn't just those of us who don't want to drink. And it was so neat to see, because you still had something in your hand. It was something different than just a water, right? But then if you wanted wine, get wine. That's great. So I love this idea of like, it's just the inclusivity that's really important to you.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think that one of the perceptions that I had when I was first getting sober was like, my life was over. I was no longer going to have fun. And the reality is I have way more fun now because I'm not afraid of what I might do. And so now, I mean, I love getting out and dancing. I love playing fun games. I love being silly and goofy. As the introvert, I also then like to be able to sort of be in a quiet space and have a quiet conversation with 2 or 3 people and get to know them a bit better. So I just want all the options. And I want all the options for everybody. That's what inclusivity is about.
Yeah. So when you think of sober inclusivity, that to you means activities, opportunities for every single person, no matter where they are on this journey.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think to your point, there are even people who drink would like to go to an event and not have the pressure to drink, right? Would like to be like, oh, cool. I don't want to have, we all have a choice, but I don't want to have I'm going to have a beer, but if they didn't have beer, I'd be fine without it. So like having those options.
Completely. One of our founding members who joined really early on, he drinks. And he says that what he objects to is the over drinking. And he's younger. He's probably in his late 30s. And so all of, his age people, all they're like, hey, let's go hit the bars. And he's like, great. I love hitting the bars. They go have their first couple drinks. And then same thing. He wants to bolt because it starts getting sloppy.
The same stuff. Yeah. That's interesting. He's one of your first members and he's not, that is, I love that. That is interesting.
Yep. Over half of our members are not pure sober.
Interesting. Talk a little bit about this sober wingman. How do you guys define a sober wingman?
So I came up with this term because one of my very best friends, who was one of the 4 that knew that I was sober, when we would go to these meetings, the first thing she would do is people would say, oh, let's go head to the bar, or can I get you something? And I'd say, my go-to, I'll just have a club soda and lime. And she would grab my arm and she'd say, no, let's go get you something more fun than that.
Yeah.
Right. Or when things would start to get sloppy, or somebody would start to where they lean in and they're like breathing alcohol on you. She would just come over and she would just sort of bump my shoulder and she'd say, you okay?
Yeah. She's the check-in.
She was my wingman.
Yeah. Oh, and what does that mean to you in those opportunities or in those times?
Like savior. I mean, I felt seen. I felt seen in a place that I was trying to make myself invisible.
Oh, interesting.
I felt valued in a place that I felt as though my journey was not valued. And so I really think it's important, this notion of including our sober wingmen in our community, because all of them have some reason, some family member, some friends, some story where they've seen what alcohol can do and how it can bring people down.
Yeah.
And they may not be able to help their loved one, but they can lift us up and be walking together with us on this journey.
Oh, I love your friend. What beautiful. It was interesting. I was excited to share this with you, and I haven't really shared it yet. We had an experience this past weekend. We went to dinner with a couple and this other gentleman. So there's 5 of us, and we're this really good like Asian food, family style. And he ordered like a bottle of some type of Japanese liquor, right? And they're like, "How many cups?" And they said 4. I was like, "I'm not drinking," but well, she ended up bringing 5 over. And I saw the 5 and he started to pour, and I was like, "I'm good." And I noticed my friend across had just slowly grabbed a cup and moved it aside. And it was such a
Hmm.
small effort because all of a sudden I was like, "Wait, there's 4." And I looked over and she had just like slowly been like, just moved it over. And it was like such a kind gesture that I was like, that is
Yes.
somebody who's thinking, how do I support her? I don't want her to have, and I would have been fine saying it. I didn't, but that's what a sober wingman does, right? It like knows that I'm here for you. I'm
Absolutely.
supporting this. And it was just
Yeah.
like I think about all the time, I was like, God, that's like such a, and when you say it, like you feel seen, you feel valued. And it was such a,
Yeah.
it was a small but very significant gesture.
Absolutely. I mean, her coming over and just bumping shoulders with
Yeah.
me.
Like I got you. Yeah.
How you doing? Yeah.
Well, tell me, I mean, I could talk to you for days, but tell me like if you guys are working in this space, which I love, right? And whether you're AA, don't drink again, or you're just like this gentleman, you're like, I just don't think we should be the excessive. If you are somebody who wants to make your life more sober inclusive, right? Maybe you don't have meetings, but it's important for you to, make sure your friends or provide other opportunities. What are maybe like 1 or 2 tips of advice you would have for somebody to do that?
To extend their network.
Well, maybe just like an example of you if you are somebody who is who wants to have more sober inclusive experiences, whether it's like a
Mm,
happy hour at their house or you have maybe your small moms group, just something like that. Maybe what are 1 or
mhm.
2 things that you guys have done that you think would be helpful for an individual?
Well, I think that, because things like Dry January are so big now,
Mhm.
I think that there are ways that you can make suggestions for, like, let's say that you are a part of a bunco group or a mom's group or
Mhm.
something, and it's always like, "Hey, I'll bring the wine, you bring the food." It could be like, "Hey, let's experiment with, like, making fun mocktails one night."
Mhm.
I think that there are people who would be excited to do that, even if they're accustomed to normally drinking,
Mhm.
and you could kind of extend that bridge
Yeah.
between, "Hey, we can still have fun
Mhm.
without it having to be wine-centered."
Yeah.
Um, but I also think that I have had to learn to pick my battles.
Mm.
So there's times when I'm with a group of professional friends and they're like, "Hey, we're gonna go down to this bar, wanna come?"
Mm.
I'm not gonna disrupt their fun.
Mm. Mhm.
I'm not gonna say, "No, let's not go to a bar."
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
generally, I'll pass.
Yeah.
But I think that if it's like, "Hey, do you guys wanna go out somewhere?" I'll then suggest somewhere that
Mhm.
I know is gonna have a variety of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
Um, One of the other things that I never did before, but I'm starting to do now, is that when people sit down at a table and the first thing they do is say, "Anybody like the wine list or the drinks list?"
Mhm.
I'm speaking up first and saying, "Hey, I'd love to know if you guys have a mocktail list." And
Mhm.
what's happening is that a couple of other people are like, "Oh, yeah, I'd like that too."
Yeah, you gotta lead, huh? You gotta be the leader in the
Uh-huh,
group. Mhm.
uh-huh. So as uncomfortable as it was the first time,
Mhm.
having seen the reactions of other people, it's like becoming kind of a fun little game to say, "I wonder who's going to perk up when I say that."
Oh, I love that. That's a great I haven't tried that. I love that idea because 'cause I'll kind of, like, look on my own, um,
Right.
but I love that idea of and you're right, 'cause and then they try and like, "These are really good," and it actually, like, tricks your brain, like, it does the trick of having a cocktail or a non-alcoholic beer, and then you're like,
Mhm.
"Oh, and then I'm coherent and all the things."
Yep.
Again, I could talk to you forever, but I have like my 2 final questions, and I'll put how to get a hold of
Okay.
you in the show notes, and we'll definitely keep tracks. We can support you in this journey, but would
Thank
love
you.
to hear, what if somebody's listening and they're kind of questioning their relationship with alcohol, thinking they maybe need to get some support. What's maybe a tip of advice you would give that helped you on your journey?
Mm. I think that my story is one that really, I wasn't in a questioning my relationship with alcohol place. I was so deep in
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
But I have worked with a number of different women who they were more open to that conversation.
Mhm.
And I would say that if you're even having that conversation in your own head,
Mhm.
it's probably something that you should look at.
Yeah.
People who don't have a disruptive relationship with alcohol don't ask themselves that question,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I love to have a little bit of candy on occasions when I need to pick me up in the afternoon, but I know people who can't get through the day without their
Mhm.
sweets.
Mhm.
That's not me. I don't question my relationship with candy. So,
Totally.
but some people do, and that's
Yeah.
okay. Um, but I would say that
Mhm.
find the journey that works for you.
Mhm.
AA is not the only way to get sober. It's the way I got sober.
Mhm.
Treatment centers are not necessary for everybody, but for me, it was so helpful.
Yeah.
Um, Counseling can be helpful.
Mhm.
Working in a community of people, I think, is really helpful because it brings us out of isolation and it
Mm.
helps us realize that what we thought was just happening to us
Yeah.
is actually a feeling that many other people share.
Mm.
Find
Yeah.
the thing that works best for you and where you are in
Mm.
your journey. And the other thing I would say is that, my story is that once I made this decision, I am just stubborn enough that I was not going to give up. But I know a lot of
Yeah.
people who it took 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
10 times to finally get this thing figured out.
Mhm.
And that's okay because their life is just as good today as
Yeah.
mine is.
Yeah. Oh,
So
thank you for
don't give
bringing
up.
that up. Thank you for bringing that up because it's the whole like comparing your life to a highlight reel, right? So
Yeah.
our journeys need to be what they are. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
last question. I know you do a lot of space with all the sober versions. What does soberish mean to you?
So I think sober-ish means somebody who's not made a decision to never
Mhm.
drink,
Mhm.
but only chooses to have a drink in a moment.
Mhm. Mhm. Love that.
So one person I know, she has shared that she'll have a glass of champagne at a wedding toast, and she'll have a sip or
Mhm.
two of it, and that's
Mhm.
enough.
Yeah.
Some people, maybe it's that they drink 5 or 6 times a year or once a
Mhm.
month, but it's a conscious choice in a moment that only lasts for that moment.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Margy, I am so proud to know you. I am so proud that you stepped out into the openness of what you're doing. It is so, so, so important, especially
Thank
when we're
you.
having meetings that affect our livelihood, our careers,
Mhm.
our all the things to provide these space for all humans is so important.
Yeah.
And I am so, so excited that you are living your sober life rocks out and proud. So thank you for being you.
Thank you. And for those who want more information, we are at soberliferocks.com. We are starting in the dental space because that's where both Laura, my co-founder, and I
Mhm.
primarily focus. But we are going to be expanding it sort of industry by industry. But as a member, if you would like to join, there's absolutely no need that you're in dentistry. We would love to have you as part of our community.
Wonderful. Yes. And I will put, and we have a website. I'll put how to get a hold of
Mhm.
you and all the ways. And yes, definitely if you're interested or in an industry meeting planner, curious about a sober event, be sure to reach out to Margy and her business partner because it's really important that we
Excellent.
get out and do that. So again,
Excellent. Thank
we'll
you for
have that in the
having me.
notes. Yes, thank you for being here and thank you for tuning in. We always appreciate a review, a share if you enjoy this podcast. Forward it to anybody who is sober curious, sober-ish. And remember, everything you want is on the other side of saying no to that drink.